Greetings to everyone. This presentation is on disaster management.
Okay, what is this disaster? Disaster is an undeniable occurrence resulting from forces that are largely outside human control, strikes quickly with a little or non-warning, which causes or threatens serious disruption of life and property, including death and injury to a large number of people. American Red Cross. A disaster can be defined as an occurrence either natural or man-made that causes human suffering and creates human needs that victims cannot alleviate without assistance. A disaster is defined as a disruption on a massive scale, either natural or man-made, occurring in short or long periods. Disaster can lead to human, material, economic, or environmental hardship, which can be beyond the bearable capacity of affected society. Now let us discuss about types of disaster. Natural disaster and man-made disaster. Natural disasters. A disaster caused by natural factors called as natural disaster. For example, earthquake, flood, cyclone, etc. Man-made disaster. A disaster caused due to human activities. Example, war, fire accidents, industrial accidents, etc. Natural disasters. Meteorological disasters, topographical disasters, environmental disasters. In, meteor, in meteorological disaster includes floods, tsunami, cyclone, typhoon, snowstorms, besides hailstorms. In topographical disasters include earthquake, volcanic eruption, landslide, asteroseismic eruptions. In environmental disasters include global warming, ozone depletion, radiations, solar flares. Man-made disasters include technological disaster, industrial disaster, warfare disaster. In technological disaster, transport failure, public place failure, fire. In industrial disaster, chemical spills, radioactivity spills. In warfare disaster, war, terrorism, internal conflict, civil unrest. Now we can discuss about what is disaster management. Disaster management is how we deal with the human, material, economic, or environmental impacts of said disaster. It is a process of how we prepare for, respond to, and learn from the effects of major failures. The Disaster Management Act of 2005 defines disaster management as an integrated process of planning, organizing, coordinating, and implementing measures which are necessary for prevention of threat of any disaster, reduction of risk of any disaster or its consequence, readiness to deal with any disaster, promotions in dealing with a disaster, assessing the severity of the effects of any disaster, rescue and relief, rehabilitation and reconstitution.
Now let's take a look at the different phases of disaster management. So the first phase is that preparedness. It refers to activities prior to a disaster. It includes preparing plans, emergency exercises, training, and warning systems. The second phase is that of response. It refers to activities during a disaster, like the public warning systems, emergency operations, and search and rescue missions. The third phase is that of recovery. This refers to activities following a disaster, like temporary housing, grants, medical claims, and other claim processing situations. The fourth phase is that of mitigation. It refers to activities that reduce the effects of disaster. It includes things like building codes and zoning, vulnerability analysis, and public education. Now let's discuss the different phases in detail. The first phase is that of preparedness. It means to take actions ahead of time to be ready for an emergency. The preparedness phase occurs before a disaster takes place. It is an ongoing multi-sectoral activity. It is an integral part of the national system responsible for developing plans and programs for disaster management, prevention, mitigation, response, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So as we already said, it is a multi-sectoral activity. So this requires a coordination of the various sectors to carry out the evaluation of the risk, adopt standards and regulations, organize communication and response mechanism, ensure all resources are ready and easily mobilized, develop public education programs, coordinate informations with news media, and disaster stimulation exercises. The second phase is that of response. It means to protect people and property in the wake of an emergency, disaster, or crisis. The response phase comes after the immediate aftermath of a disaster. The focus is on addressing immediate threats to people, property, and economy. We could say that it is an immediate reaction to a disaster, as disaster is anticipated, or soon after it begins in order to assess the needs, reduce the sufferings, limit the spread and consequences of disaster, and open up the way to rehabilitation. So this is done by mass evacuation, search and rescue, emergency medical services, securing food and water, and the maintenance of the law and order. As the response period progresses, focus will typically shift from the immediate emergency issues to conducting repairs, restoring utilities, re-establishing operations, and cleaning up. There will also be a need to begin planning the reconstruction of the damaged infrastructure. So the most important activity of the response phase is to ensure that people are out of harm's way. It will then move on to assess damage, implement disaster response plans, triage cleanup efforts, and start resource distribution as necessary. The third phase is that of recovery, that is to rebuild after a disaster and to return back to what was normal. The recovery phases takes place after the disaster. This includes repatriation, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. So as the emergency is over, displaced people return to their place of origin. Next, it is rehabilitation. That is the restoration of the basic social functions. It includes providing temporary shelters, stress debriefing for responders and victims, economic rehabilitation, psychosocial rehabilitation, and scientific damage assessment. Then comes the phase of reconstruction, that is the rebuilding of homes and permanently repairing and rebuilding infrastructures. So usually a recovery phase of disaster can last anywhere from 6 months to 1 year. It could even go longer depending on the severity of the incident. The elements of recovery include the community recovery, infrastructure recovery, economy recovery, and the environment recovery. The fourth phase is that of mitigation, that is to prevent future emergency and take steps to minimize their effects. The main aim is to take steps to protect people and property while also decreasing risk and consequences from a given disaster situation. The main goal is to reduce vulnerability to disaster impacts such as property damage, injuries, and loss of life. This phase aims to seek a permanent reduction of disaster to limit impact of human suffering and economic assets. So it mainly includes of primary mitigation and secondary mitigation. The primary mitigation includes steps to reduce hazard and vulnerability. The second is the secondary mitigation, which focuses on reducing the effects of the hazard. Now let's take a look at the different components of mitigation. The first one is the hazard identification and mapping. An assessment is done by estimation probability of a damaging phenomenon of a given magnitude in a given area. This is done taking into consideration of the history, probability of various intensities, maximum threat, and possibly secondary hazards. The main aim is reducing hazard protection, that is, a kind of protection against the threat by removing the cause of the threat. The second component is the vulnerability analysis, a process which results in an understanding of the types and levels of exposure of persons, property, and environment to the effects of identified hazards at a particular time. The main aim is reducing vulnerability, that is, reducing the effect of the threat. third component is of risk analysis, that is, determining nature and scale of losses which can be anticipated in a particular area. It involves analysis of probability of a hazard of a particular magnitude, elements that could bring potential loss or damage, the nature of the vulnerability, and the specified future time period. The fourth phase or the fourth component of the phase of mitigation is that prevention. It refers to activities taken to prevent a natural phenomenon or potential hazard from having a harmful effect on either people or economic assets. Now let's take a look at the disaster vulnerability profile of India. As per statistics, India's wall is sensitive to 30 different types of disasters that will affect economic, social, and human development potential to such an extent that it will have a long-term effects in productivity and macroeconomic performance of the country. The Indian land is 58% sensitive to earthquakes, 16% sensitive to droughts, 12% to floods, 8% to cyclones and hurricanes, and 3% to landslides. Now let's look at certain agencies involved in disaster management in our country. The first is the National Disaster Management Authority, NDMA. It is an apex body for disaster management headed by Prime Minister of India. It is responsible for the supervision, direction, and control of the National Disaster Response Force, NDRF. The second is the National Executive Committee, NEC. The NEC is composed of high-profile ministerial members from the Government of India. The NEC prepares the National Plan for Disaster Management as per the National Policy on Disaster Management. Third is the State Disaster Management Authority, SDMA. The Chief Minister of the respective state is the head of SDMA. The state government has a State Executive Committee, SEC, which assists the State Disaster Management Authority on disaster management. The fourth is the District Disaster Management Authority, DDMA. The DDMA is headed by the District Collector or the Deputy Commissioner or the District Magistrate, depending on the situation. The DDMA ensures that the guidelines framed by the NDMA and the SDMA are followed by all the departments of the state government at the district level and the local authorities in the district. Fifth is the local authorities. Local authorities would include Panchayati Raj institutions, municipalities, districts, and Cantonment 11 institutional and legal arrangement boards, and town planning authorities, which control and manage civic services. With this, we come to an end to the presentation on disaster management. Thank you.